This is Platemark. My name is Ann Shafer, and I am your host. I'm an independent curator specializing in prints and printmaking. You've found me at Series 3 of Platemark, in which I'm interviewing intriguing and wonderful people who occupy various roles in the print ecosystem. Today's guest is Lothar Osterburg, who is, I think probably, and he'd probably agree, the world's preeminent practitioner of photogravure, which is a technique that basically marries photography and printmaking. So lots of questions for him about that, of course. You will have some, and I hope that I asked the right ones. You can let me know if I didn't. Okay, let's see. Housekeeping. Positionality. I identify as a cis het white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. Any images that Lothar and I talk about will be over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. You know that. And you could hit the support and donate button over at platemarkpodcast.com and help me keep the lights on here. All right, buckle up and here we go. Lothar, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark.
Thank you for having me.
Well, of course. Usual first step is to have our guests introduce themselves for our listeners. Can you do that?
Yes, my name is Lothar Osterburg. I was born in Germany, West Germany, when it was still West Germany, went to art school there. So I'm an artist, I'm a printmaker, sculptor and photographer, but I'm also a collaborative printmaker, plate maker, and photogravure, and working with quite a few artists, have been working with quite a few artists throughout my career, and I'm running my own printmaking workshop up in the Hudson Valley in New York.
Nice. So I came to you because you are the guy for photogravure, so I'm excited to dig into that. But let's do your bio. So you came from Germany as a graduate student or an undergraduate
Well,
student?
they don't quite have, or it did not have that same system, the American system in Germany at that point. It was basically, you go to high school for 13 grades instead of 12. So you basically complete your general education, all the distribution requirements or whatever you would call them in various places here. You do that in high school, and then go to university or art school or something and already specialize quite with a very specific directions when you even apply to the school. So even within art school, you apply to become an artist as a high school teacher, as a middle school teacher, or as a what they call free artist, meaning you have no job prospects. So they're overlapping degrees, and we were together with the candidates for the high school teacher positions, which I actually started in that program, but I was very unhappy having to have a second subject, and I tried various things out, and I just was so impatient with having to do something else and get distracted, and I fell really in love with the studio practice, being in the studio and working as much as I could. So I switched over to what's called free art in Germany.
But how are you supposed to know when you're in high school, even if you're 18 or 19 years old, which track? I mean, that has always confused me, honestly, about the European system.
Back then, that was really, yes, you had to decide that at that age, and that was kind of the norm. And people do change, but not. It's, you invest a lot of time in it. By the time you realize it's the wrong thing, and not everyone switches out. But I'm teaching now at a liberal arts college, Bard College in the Hudson Valley, actually not very close to where I'm living. And I really appreciate that system in the United States where you have 2 years in college to try out all kinds of things before you declare your major. And that's actually a really fantastic system. And I wish I had that chance back then to really try things out. I actually was on track to become a musician. My parents were both musicians, and I played piano, double bass, and was actually on track to apply to music academy as a double bass player. But my double bass teacher did the best favor to me. he took me aside and said, Lothar, you're slightly dyslexic. You're having a hard time reading music fast enough to play quickly. And B, you hate practicing. You don't practice enough at all. You have a great ear. You can play, and you can play by ear. You can listen and then imitate. But as soon as you don't know what you imitate, then you have no idea what to do. I recommend you to do something else. And that hurt as an 18-year-old. But it was like the best advice he could have ever given me. He also followed it up by describing the very hierarchical structure in an orchestra, how I would, as a last or the worst double bass player in an orchestra that desperately needed a double bass, I would be like the lowest person in the totem pole. And he knew already how many problems I had with authority.
Oh.
So, but yeah, so he actually became one of my first collectors of my work.
Oh,
so he
funny.
really supported what my hobby was already, like painting in oil and doing some drawings. It was cool as a teenager to do that. But I think I was pretty decent back then, and I've actually started. I have a show up right now at the Pamela Salisbury Gallery in Hudson, New York, which I'm calling The Long Way In, referring to the 40 years of my art career, or more, actually, more than 40 years art career, on my path to having my first major museum show, which will be at the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum in Braunschweig, Germany, which is one of the oldest public museums in Europe, next to the British Museum. It was a private collection by this Duke Herzog Anton Ulrich, which became public in around 1750s. I'm very bad with exact dates, but it has a very large print collection, and mostly Baroque prints. They have the Piranesi prints. They have all the Goya prints and tons of Rembrandt and so on. And yeah, I'm going to have a show, hopefully. Still have nothing in writing, but a show there at the end of 2025. Wrong century. It's 2025, so in another 2.5 years. My show in Hudson is sort of like the trajectory of how did I get here, like the 40 years from the dream of becoming an artist, applying to art school. And now I forgot the point I was trying to make, but...
But Braunschweig is your hometown, right?
Braunschweig is my hometown, so it's basically my homecoming after having been away for 37 years or so now. It's 35, 6, 80. Sorry, I can't do the math. Yeah, it's like a long time.
I'll try and do some math for you. I'm not good at it either.
That's why we became artists. Can't read, can't write, can't do math. We have to do something.
But though the show in Hudson, which for listeners, I don't know when the show closes, you're about to tell me, but know that probably this episode will air after the closing of the show, I'm guessing.
The show is running to June 18th.
Okay. So included in the show in Hudson is all works on paper, or are there sculptures?
Oh, yeah. In my own work, I have for the last 20 or more years... actually, let me back up.
Okay.
In art school, I was never interested in photography because I always felt photography was just surface. It was just like a gelatin paper with some ephemeral image on it. But I loved the tactility of drawing and painting. And in my second year at art school, we had foundations year. In the second year, we could specialize. And I had seen some of the art students making prints, and I was fascinated by the tactility and the blackness of a drawing. I love drawing, and the blackness in a lithograph or an etching was just so much stronger and more subtle and nuanced and beautiful than I could get in charcoal or pencil. So I signed up for printmaking classes, and I became a pretty decent lithographer and just started living in the print shop there. Coincidentally, the technicians at that art school were really interested in photogravure, or heliogravure, as you would say in German, which maybe this is a good point to actually say what we're talking about.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned heliogravure. So yes, go ahead. And if they're just the same term, I'm happy to know it.
Oh my God! Yeah, you're starting a point here. The terminology is a bit tricky, especially in translation, and there are a lot of museums in this country who are not quite getting that straight. And there's a few pet peeves I have here.
Oh, excellent. Let's put the record out there.
Well, first of all, yeah, heliogravure is photogravure in English, but photogravure in French, and I did butcher that pronunciation.
It's okay.
It means actually not just photo etching, but any kind of other photographic printing process, including business cards. And so when something comes from France, I think the MoMA does that. It becomes a photogravure here too, but if it comes from Germany, it's kind of, they don't know what to do with it. The one is like the translations, because a lot of people just don't know exactly what photogravure is and what the difference between photogravure and photo etching or photolithography is. And I'm about to explain. The other thing is I really would like to encourage anyone who has anything to do with printing in art, in museums, in galleries and stuff, to maybe take a little workshop, even just to learn a little bit about not just sort of the theoretical background as read in a book, but also at least observe it, how it's done, to have an idea of, oh my God, that's what I'm selling. Or showing and curating, and oh yeah, now I understand the difference. So photogravure, and that's I learned photogravure I'm jumping here, sorry.
It's okay.
I was lucky enough to get a job at Crown Point Press in San Francisco in 1989.
Nice.
And this was shortly before the earthquake. So I was there during the big move. We moved into that big Hawthorne Street building.
Were you there with Pam and Renee?
Exactly. They were my colleagues. Both Pam and I became independent at the same time and started our own shops. When we renovated, we were working on a project with Christian Boltanski, which had been sourced out to someone else. And that did not really work well because it was done so remotely. That person was very busy, never talked to the artist. And the plates that came back were too contrasty, and the artists all rejected them all. It was a pretty bad disaster, I think, for the press because they paid a good bit of money for them. And then the earthquake happened. The project was put on hold. The earthquake happened. And after the earthquake, we had this building which was oversized for what we actually really needed. But it gave us all these opportunities, and money was good at that time still. It was just before the art market crash of the early 90s. So kind of bad timing in that sense. But they decided to put in a dark room, and each of us printers had to be in charge of one area, and they asked around, like, has anyone ever worked in a dark room? And I had dabbled a little bit in black and white photography, mostly as a quick sketchbook for me, not to become a photographer. So I really was a very lousy printer, photographic printer, darkroom printer. So, but I was put in charge of putting that place together. So I did a lot of research, and the idea was to do these Christian Boltanski plates in-house. So photogravure is rarely used even at that time and still today. It's a 19th century photographic process that is completely continuous tone that makes it very different from photo etching or photolithography, which uses a half tone that breaks up the image into larger or smaller dots that are evenly spaced, but covered with the same amount of ink throughout the entire area of the plate. So it's just a proportional coverage of the paper by ink that makes the image appear darker or lighter. And yes, there are absolute fantastic halftone prints around where the dot is so minutely small that you cannot see it with your bare eye, and you just have to get out the magnifying glass to see it. But in photogravure, you etch a aqua tinted plate into varying depths. So it's basically like a stepped aqua tint, except you don't have real steps. You have a gradual shift of depth in the etching plate with an aqua tint that may be etched for 40 minutes in the shadows and 10 minutes in the lighter grays or mid grays and seconds in the highlights. So you get this incredible dynamic range in the plate between black and white, and you get incredible softness with it as well. So when I first saw photogravure, and actually I first did even the worst first experiments in it, I started falling in love with it. I'm not sure how much I said earlier in my art school, they dabbled in photogravure, and I was not interested in it because also I was not interested in just taking a camera and photographing something existing and then making a print out of it and say, that's my art. It's like, oh, I just saw it somewhere. I didn't know yet what one could eventually do with a camera. And that actually, you mentioned earlier, what am I showing at my show in Hudson? Long way around, not just a long way in, a long way to explain something. I have started, 25 or more years ago, to build my own sets to photograph. So it started out with simple copper wire that was lying in big piles in a squatted loft in San Francisco I was living in. And I started using the wire to make three-dimensional drawings. So I was interested in the line, but also the line as a projection and the line as, describing something, not just on a 2D piece of paper, but also in space so that you can turn around. And I'd done that basically to paint from them, to use as model to superimpose on paintings, holding in front of me, and then kind of my own projection where my eye was the projector. And then a friend, a colleague of mine at Crown Point Press had a 4x5 camera that he desperately wanted to sell because he needed money. And it was a, lowish end 4x5 camera with one lens but a lot of holders, and it was cheap enough that I said, I'll do it. I'm interested. I'm going to try this. So I started photographing these wire drawings with this camera, and first of all I noticed that lens is a landscape lens, not like for close-ups for the models. So I took a magnifying glass on one of those gooseneck things and put it in front of the lens, and that's where I started loving photography, because that was distortion happening, that was like going in and out of focus, then I could light it and the shadow took on its own life. So I started photographing those little wire drawings and started practicing. While we were learning photogravure for Christian Boltanski, I was practicing on tiny small plates how to get better so I really got interested in photogravure at that time. This was like late 89, early 1990.
And this is, by the way, listeners, long before easily accessible CAD drawings in the computer to aid you in any way. Like, this is all pre-computer.
Yes. There was one book on photogravure, and I've actually forgot the name. I may have to give that to you a little later. That was decent, but it was overly complicated, and we tried to imitate it, and it used things like silver plating the copper to make it perfectly clear to then adhere. And I haven't gotten into how photogravure is done yet, but it just made it so overly complicated that we just got lost. But ultimately what happened is Catherine Brown from Crown Point Press, she invited John Goodman, who is a great photogravure, printer and plate maker, to come out for a week to give us a private workshop and help us get started in our own shop with these Christian Boltanski plates. And while he was there, we got 2 plates done out of 24. It was a 3-month. I worked on that with Daria Shivolak in the darkroom for 3 months, making plates. Christian Boltanski plates, they are these ephemeral, soft focus portraits that don't hide anything. So any little piece of dust, speck of dust, any squeegee mark, drying mark will show and will make the plate unusable. So thanks to Catherine, who financed this thing, I learned photogravure by making, basically, we made an average of 3 attempts per good plate on that one.
Wow.
It was quite a waste, not waste, but like quite a learning curve. It was like probably the hardest project to learn it on. But I learned a lot. We learned a lot during that time.
Trial by fire.
Yeah. Then coincidentally, I was put on more subsequent projects that used photogravure at Crown Point Press, which was John Baldessari, Marcus Ratz, who kind of came in, and he works a lot with these, even in drawing, with projection from your eye onto the wall. And it was kind of uncanny because I was doing that already with my own drawings, but in a very different way than him. But there was kind of a weird overlap. He came to the press and said, I've done a lot of printmaking. What do you do what I've never done? And, well, photogravure came up, and I thought, oh, my God, I'm not that good to kind of on the fly do photogravure. With both Christian Boltanski and John Baldessari, we were able to make the plates before the artist even arrived. So I had that comfort to say, I can redo this plate. But here I was suddenly being watched and had to perform live. And what Marcus Ranston actually did was really interesting. He said, I'm not interested in the camera. I'm not interested in the darkroom. Let's expose the gelatin resist, and I'm going to get into the technical process right after this. So directly in the sun.
Oh.
So he used shadows. He used a shaving mirror onto which he had drawn a face to reflect sunlight back onto the gelatin to expose that, to create these kind of weird, you don't quite know what it is, but it's just the shadow projection of what he placed in front of it. Under a skylight in our studio. That opened up sort of like this, oh my, this is like a world opens up here. So this is wonderful. So, how...
Okay, here we go.
Maybe some of the viewers have heard of soap ground, also called white ground or cloud ground, some people call it. But
I've never heard that one.
I've heard it a few times, and I thought, that's an interesting name.
Okay.
But which is a ground that breaks down by absorbing water or softening over time because it has soap in it, and soap dissolves in the water of the acid and then softens, and then the acid has a delayed it's delayed getting to the plate to etch at a delayed rate. So we did some beautiful Pat Steer prints at Crown Point Press using that soap ground with the waterfalls. And it kind of gets this kind of soft, it's not spit bite, but it's the reverse of spit bite. So the soap, well, the soap is the resist. You put the entire plate in the acid, so everything which is not covered gets black. And wherever you have some soap, even like the minutest amount, remains lighter because the acid doesn't get into it. So photogravure,
and it's sorry, may I interrupt? So the soap ground is generally painted onto the plate with brushes?
Yes.
Okay.
But I wanted to make a reference to a traditional printmaking process, which photogravure kind of uses the principle of.
Okay.
So in photogravure, the acid resist is gelatin. And the gelatin now comes on with a backing paper coated with gelatin that's pigmented with iron oxide, and it's not sensitive to light. You sensitize it with potassium dichromate.
Oh.
Potassium dichromate hardens an organic substance under the influence of ultraviolet light. It's also used in gum bichromate printing or silkscreen emulsion.
Ah, okay.
So that's hardens the emulsion to light, and then when you wash it out, the emulsion comes off. The pigmentation of the gelatin in photogravure, of that photogravure gelatin tissue paper, we call it, keeps the light from hardening the gelatin evenly throughout, because gelatin normally is clear, it's evenly throughout the layer. So it hardens the gelatin from the top down in accordance with the amount of light it receives. So where it's very light, it hardens the gelatin pretty deep into the depth. Where the film is very dark, it hardens the gelatin very little. So you have a gradual layer of thicker or thinner hardened gelatin within your gelatin layer. You then transfer that gelatin face down onto the copper plate so that your photographic relief is now touching the copper. You kind of wet the gelatin becomes sticky, you squeegee it on, dry it a little bit, and then develop it in just hot water. And the hot water melts the unhardened gelatin, just like you would make Jell-O. And what remains is the photographic relief on the copper plate.
In a gelatin layer.
In a gelatin layer on the copper plate. And that's just the resist. Then
Right.
You need to have an aquatint on there.
That's just the beginning.
Right, that's the beginning, yes. So you need your good aquatint on there. And the first 10 or 15 years I did photogravure, I did rosin aquatint on top of that gelatin, just regular aquatint in any print shop. I now use a photographic screen that exposes the same exact pattern as the rosin would drop on the plate, very fine little dots photographically into the same gelatin. So it's already built in, that aquatint.
Wait a minute. Hold on. So, wait, you got a sorry. When you shake the rosin onto a plate, it's, even if it's very fine, it can't be regular.
Right.
So your screen, though, is regular.
No, I actually get this amazing screen. There's few people who make them, but this is a screen from Peter Ragnarsson in Sweden, who exposes a high lith film, like a high contrast film, to a ground piece of physical glass that the contact exposes, and that glass refracts the light very much in the pattern of the irregularness of an aquatint. So I get an aquatint with his screens. I get an aquatint that really looks like an analog physical rosin aquatint.
Oh my God! Now, so is that screen reusable,
Yes.
or is it a one shot?
It's reusable as long as I don't spill anything, scratch it. Yes, they're fragile, so I have to really take them, handle them with care. But yeah, they're reusable. But it makes it more predictable than it used to be when I first started. So over melted aquatint on a photogravure plate really looks horrible.
Wait, I'm still confused, because if you drop rosin on a plate and it forms a way for the acid to swim around.
Well,
go ahead.
So the function of can the viewers see me?
Yes.
Will they see me? So
yes.
The function of the aquatint is to, like, you drop the rosin on, you melt it on, you have sort of 10,000 islands of protected plate areas. So the acid will etch around those islands and leave those islands intact. Then depending on how deep you etch it, you have these little columns like Bryce Canyon. When you wipe it, you wipe from surface to surface to surface to surface and leave the ink in between. And depending how deep it's etched, you have more, it's darker or lighter. So you need these land areas. So if these were physically rosin particles that had been melted on there, or hardened columns of gelatin that was sitting on them, doesn't really matter in the end. So as long as those little columns don't etch and you have these land areas. If you don't have the land areas and you just etch the plate down,
right,
then you have a plate that is, well, intaglio means anything below the surface prints. You have a surface that's just at a lower spot than it used to be, and you still wipe all the ink off and nothing happens. I've had students who forgot their aqua tint, etched their photogravure plate, and it looked beautiful in the progression as it etched, but then they wiped it and only the fence showed, because the fence were dark lines in a plane and kind of acted like a hard ground etching. And the rest was just shallow grooves of beautiful settled tones that everything wiped out. So you need the aqua tint to hold the ink and kind of have...
So I guess my confusion is the difference between droplets and acid doing their thing and a physical solid screen of...
Well, the screen only exposes land areas, just like the physical rosin melts on the plate and creates land areas.
All right.
The acid still etches around those land areas in either case.
Okay. All right.
Well, now, the photogravure only works on copper with ferric chloride.
Oh, interesting.
The reason is ferric chloride is not really an acid. It's a corrosive salt that is in solution with water. And gelatin has this wonderful property of being able to absorb up to 100 times its volume in water.
Did not know that.
Well, if you've ever made Jell-O, you put this little package of gelatin into a jar of water, mix it up, let it sit for an hour, and then you have a glass of fish roe with no water in it, because it's all this kind of these pellets. All the water has been absorbed in this tiny little amount of gelatin. The gelatin is also, it's an organic substance, so the ferric chloride has no chemical reaction with the gelatin. And it's therefore also considered a relatively safe etchant in your studio because, A, you don't need a heavy ventilation. And if you get it on your hand, after 10 minutes, you may have a rash, but you can wash it off and you're usually fine. When you get ferric chloride on it, it burns if you have a little cut. And if you get in your eye or your mouth, it really stings. So don't do it. So be careful nevertheless. But it's a relatively safe etchant. When you put a photogravure plate in ferric chloride, what will happen, the gelatin is now, of course, dried after all the washing out and stuff. So the dried gelatin has shrunk to a hundredth of its volume. So basically the molecular structure in the gelatin is so tight that the ferric chloride molecule can't get through. So it protects the copper underneath. As soon as the ferric chloride in a little pinhole or the edges gets to the copper, it is an immediate chemical reaction, pretty much regardless of how much water is in the solution. We are working with very dense solution where there's very little free water in it, so like almost saturated ferric chloride. And there's very little water to soften the gelatin. As it softens, it absorbs water and the molecular structure opens up. And once it's opened up enough that the ferric chloride can find its way through, it can start biting into the copper. The thicker the gelatin is, the longer this process takes, the more water it needs to absorb to soften up enough. And that's what we're taking advantage of. And to control this process, I have 6 different baths with increasing amounts of water, which I'm moving with the plate through in the process. So I have to watch for signs of slowing down, of timing. When do I need my next value to make it look good in the whole trajectory from light to dark? And that's really where it becomes complicated, to judge it, to move on just in the right times.
Because you're using these variations in the level of water content
in this solution, yes,
like you would in a stepped acid bath. Like it's a reverse sort of.
The trajectory of the aqua tint is reverse. You start from the blacks and going into the lights. There you would in fact take it out, wash it off, dry it, block out the next area, put it back in. And the water amount in the acid will remain the same throughout the etch. But yeah, it's kind of the reverse of that aqua tint. And And if anyone knows aquatint, it's not an equal steps between values. It's an exponential timing. So you basically double your time each time you want to have one level darker. So from 30 seconds to a minute to 2 minutes to 4 minutes to 8 minutes and so on. If you just do it even steps, the values become closer and closer. Think of it value-wise. If you have a 30-minute etch and you add 1 more minute, the 1 more minute between 1 and 2 minutes doubles the time. Between 30 and 31 minutes, it's really no visible difference anymore.
Right.
You can look at it against the light and still not see anything.
Once the image and the gelatin is on the plate, you're not adding or doing any, like you don't burnish or anything, like it's set.
Well, yes. I mean, the photographic image, yes and no.
Theoretically.
The photographic image is basically you have one shot at it. There's no way to interrupt it or take it out and say, oh, this area is done, let me block it out. That won't.
No dodging or anything.
You have to do all that before. I do a little bit of dodging sometimes by mixing water with a little ferric chloride and then a brush and say, like, okay, this area really, it gets dangerous. It could really backfire with too much water and then you ruin the plate altogether.
If something goes screwy, can you clear the plate and reuse the plate, or is it done?
It's done. I mean, okay. I have a former student who invested in a palm sander and then ground the whole plate down and started repolishing it and then reusing them. A lot of work to reuse a plate. I usually just recycle the plates. Or I actually frequently in my own work use the backs so they have scratches on them and stuff and just embrace that. But there is a lot of work that you can do afterwards because you can use a la Popé printing with not for color in this case, but with different inks with a varying amount of transparent base in them to make the areas darker or lighter, to bring things out that were just etched too long. So you can really adjust the plate that way.
But you're not adding ink in a way that would be called monoprint inking. So you're not adding like a tree in ink. You're just heightening the dark.
Yeah, I just say like, oh, yeah, if this is your photogravure and this face was blown out because I didn't etch it long enough, I would say I'm going to get a very dense ink to ink my face and then a regular ink for everything around it. Tarleton it also, the edges blend, and then becomes actually a bit like dodging and burning in photography.
Okay. So
that the denser ink will kind of hold more ink and show more what's there, and frequently I can get the plates to work. And I have to do that for every print.
Right.
I mean, then there are also
to avoid it.
some plate modifications that I can do with sandpaper, like lightening things up, but also faking things in. Every good printmaker is a good cheater or faker or curator.
Problem solver.
And if it's unskillfully, no one will know. And, even if you look, I have looked at a lot of old photogravures from the early days. And if you look at it closely, you can see all kinds of plate work in those prints. And from the distance, they look perfectly photographic. And then you look, it's like, oh my God, this whole thing is burnished in because the cameras couldn't do it. Or the whole sky is spit-bit in because the films were orthochromatic and not panchromatic, meaning they would not read they would overexpose the ultraviolet light, so there is nothing in the sky, but yet they have beautiful clouds there, all either painted in on the negative or spit-bit onto the plate. So, as a photogravurist, I also think, I'm part of a long tradition. So I'm embracing that tradition as well. And so I can take a very fine piece of sandpaper, take a ball burnisher and sort of draw in on kind of slightly adding things, like a thumbprint that was on the gelatin, it didn't etch and was created like a light crescent that was like a glare or flare looked like. So I've gotten rid of those just by careful plate work that you never could see them again. So it takes time, but it's possible.
Does the plate wear down like a traditional aquatint does?
Yes. Yes. So I do have a steel facing tank. And
Wait, you can steel face gelatin?
no. Maybe I wasn't quite done.
Wait, we weren't done.
The gelatin is really the acid resist. The gelatin
right, and
is
then
the
that's
acid
gone.
resist. So once the plate is completely etched, once you reach the highlights, you wash off the plate, you wash off the acid, the ferric chloride, I mean. You wash out with that, the gelatin swells up and becomes really weak, and you can just wipe the gelatin right off the surface, and it's done. It's done its job, and you just have an aqua tinted copper plate.
Okay.
And that, yes, of course, you can then burnish. And what I also like in my own work, and very few artists I've worked with have done that. Some have, but very few, is take this photographic copper plate and rework that with regular etching techniques, like even just hard gone right over it. So there is like incongruity of process. It's not all uniformly photographic, but you really see, oh, this is being drawn on. But then in this process, unlike drawing over a photograph, you have the ink as the great unifier. So the drawn on or the spit bit part or the burnished out part is part of the same part as the photograph, the same ink, the same kind of language, except it's a different mark making language.
Right, which makes complete sense. Like in a regular etching, you'll find burnished spots and aqua tinted parts and spit bite and whatever, and it's still a contiguous design.
Right. And just because photogravure is traditionally mostly used by photographers to reproduce photographs, doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. And it's been done. It's been done a fair amount, but not really, just not as much as I would expect and as I would hope. I love that. I'm not doing it enough myself. So I have plans and I'm keeping plates and I say, I want to do this, do that. And then I'm getting sidetracked and do the next thing.
Sure.
So just to get back to my show in Hudson, I'm really kind of like jumping around here in zigzags. I've come a long way from my wire drawings that I photographed way back when. And my constructions and photographic scenes have become much more complex. And the show in Hudson, I'm kind of rebuilding from memory. So they are falsified, they are changed because my memory is no longer the pure memory from the original source, but also been influenced by other outside sources. I'm trying to remember my first artist studio that I had right after high school when I did my civil service in Germany, which was a cheap, unheated attic, very small, but like it was heaven because I had my own studio and I could make a mess. But that has sort of merged a bit with the messy, tiny studio of Francis Bacon, which I saw at the City Museum in Dublin, and I was just blown away by the tiny size of it and the amount of work he did in there.
I didn't know they had. Is that like a permanent setup that you can go see?
They moved it from London to his hometown in Dublin and put it in the City Museum. And I visited and I learned that it was there. And I thought, oh my God, I need to see that. And it was amazing.
That's cool.
You probably have seen photos of it because it's quite famous as like the mad artist studio and how small and cluttered it was. So I kind of built that, and I built things still in small scale to fit in a lunchbox. One of those lunch boxes which has a space for a thermos can in the lid. So it was tall, so it had that attic space. So it's like this tiny thing. So I built that. I made my own paint tubes out of tin foil and with a Gampi label and then a little acrylic watercolor label for just dab for the color. Made my own palette knife. So, we call that palette, not knife. The palette, just the palette without knife.
Got it.
So it all in very small scale, and put a lens in one end of the lunchbox so you can look into this lunchbox. So lunchbox is in the show. The photogravure which I made off that scene is in the show. And you can discover in the show both parts. So you can see like,
cool.
And it was actually very uncanny because some of the viewers at the opening came up to me and it's like, how did you build these? And they thought I had found or photographed some artist studio somewhere and then recreated it as a model rather than the other way around, that I built this from memory and kind of on my whim, like how I wanted it to look like, and then made a photogravure from that. Moving in and out of reality, especially using a photographic process, is what I'm really interested in. So to not fool the viewer, but draw them in and then question what they're actually looking at and say, well, but it's a photograph, but it's not real, but there's also some drawn element to it. And so that they're moving in and out of this sense of safety and security and knowledge.
I think the conceptual rigor of the whole thing works. I mean, it wouldn't be as solid if it was an actual artist studio that you had reproduced in sculptural form. Yeah. Right. No, I agree with you.
And also just photographing someone's fantastic artist studio, like if I had taken a photograph of Francis Bacon's studio and made a photogravure of it, it would have been just a photogravure of Francis Bacon's artist studio. So what I was not interested in photography in art school, I kind of solved in that way, kind of creating my own scenes. And I've done things much larger than that. The biggest was the Tower of Babel.
Yes. And how tall is it now?
Well, it's modular, so depending on the space, normally I can get it into a 9-foot high space, and usually I want that tower to reach the heaven, which in that case is the ceiling. The biggest challenge was a 28-foot ceiling at the Esther Masry Gallery in Albany, New York. They had this big, tall space with a big window to the street. And I just built this tubular, modern, kind of space-agey superstructure on top of it.
Ah.
Because I'm also thinking, it's the Tower of Babel. It takes a few hundred years to build if it doesn't fall in between. And, of course, building styles change. And that is another interest in me. I'm born in Europe. I came to the United States, and I see here we have the attitude of tearing down, rebuilding. And in Europe, it's basically how can we repurpose this building to maintain the feeling of the city, even if you completely gut it, leave just the facade, and then put something super modern in it that sticks out on the top. So I was thinking more like, why destroy? Why not sort of add and kind of make this hybrid of all those things? So that's how I approached that Tower of Babel.
Was Braunschweig bombed in the war?
Heavily, yes.
Heavily?
Yeah, so
because those, like the rebuilt, is it Leipzig? It's just, these modern, they're not that modern now, really.
Yeah, they're 50s. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, not very pretty. No.
Yeah.
Some of the historical center, they actually took whole facades of buildings to store elsewhere so they wouldn't get destroyed, and then put them back over newer structures or rebuilt structures after the war.
Is that right?
Then they built a lot of sort of fake things, so it becomes Disney-ish, where they, 50 years later, they build a medieval wood frame building there, and they say, okay, this is sitting in a 1950s plaza. It's like, that doesn't look good, or it doesn't feel right. Yeah, weird to look at that.
The Tower of Babel is it paper mache over a structure that's books that you've torn up, or
it's
what's
actually either cardstock or wood as a structure, and covered with flat book pages from books that most of which I found in the streets of Brooklyn with varying languages.
Yeah.
So that actually became the idea behind this. I'd worked with book as texture on models before, and then I thought, but in Brooklyn we have so many different languages. It's sort of the anti-Tower of Babel, or kind of the utopian idea of the biblical story of Babel, where men were punished by diversifying the languages and they couldn't communicate anymore. And now I look at it and say, well, but if we all spoke the same language, it would be kind of like the worst of Germany, where everyone speaks the language and everyone sings the same thought and everyone is afraid of the other, as we have in the United States as well, and everywhere in the world, by the way. But in fact, it was a gift of diversity.
Yes.
Of languages, of thinking, of literature, and all, and food, and everything that comes together. And that's one of the reasons why New York or other bigger cities where a lot of people from various cultures come together become such vibrant cultural hubs. Because there is this interaction and this, it's not like the harmonious idea of the United States as the melting pot and everyone has the same, unfortunately, same chances. There's still a lot of other problems, but I'm sort of trying to look at the bright side of this coming together.
Right. Okay, so back to Hudson.
We are really like flinging all over the place here today.
Hey, this is how conversations go over the dinner table, right? They're all over the place.
That's true.
Right? So, we're humans. So in addition to having the lunchbox model and its counterpart on the wall, what else is in the show?
Yeah, I have about 7 models. So the idea is really the museum show. So I wanted to have a cabinet of curiosities in it.
Ah.
And the original idea of a museum, of a collection of weird things that you want to show off. So, and I built one loosely based on a Wormsensian. There's a engraving of an old cabinet of curiosities that I got inspired by, and then I rebuilt them sort of from memory, kind of based on that, and certain aspects are becoming accurate and others becoming, I don't remember that clearly, and then I have to reinvent. So that's basically how I work, so that I'm not replicating something that looks exactly like that. But, if let's say if I wanted to do a Vermeer like room, I would have actually quite clear ideas about the window, some idea about the tiled floor, and maybe a map on the background, and then the rest becomes more nebulous. What kind of style table was there? I create it, but then I have to recreate it, and then it doesn't almost matter what kind of style table. If it's a modern one, you still believe it. So I'm creating a story that is kind of believable within it itself. So, and then I had the problem, what am I actually filling the cabinet of pure? I built the room. What am I going to put in there? So then just before that, a friend of my wife's mother had to go to a nursing home, and they were clearing her house. And she had been a seamstress and had a lot of fabric. And they asked, "Are you interested in some fabric?" And I said, "Well, I teach this book art class at Bard, but I'm also making these, I'm got interested in making my own book cloth." And they said there was a lot of sort of silk in there. And I said, "Oh, perfect," And then they just gave us like a carload of random fabric things. A lot of it we couldn't use, but a lot of it I could. So I had to sort it out. But there was like this whole bag of buttons. Weird buttons. She was like a great seamstress. She made really fashionable things and had these weird things. So I thought, oh my God, I'm going to fill this museum, this cabinet of curiosities with buttons.
I love
Which, of
buttons.
course, then creates like the buttons are plate size or like shield size in there. And it plays beautifully with scale, with what you're looking at and what's reality, reality in different levels and scale. You see it's buttons, but then the room is way too small for it to. But then it's a room. You feel like, what scale are you? So that's one thing. And again, I have the model in there and a print. And then, also thought like, I brought in the dark chamber of St. Jerome.
Oh.
I rebuilt that with that because that darkness and that spiral thing.
Sure.
St. Jerome is gone. His book is still there. The window, the lights and stuff. So I have that.
This is the Rembrandt print we're talking about, right?
Right.
Just for listeners.
And so, yeah, that's sort of my reference to the museum, like the goal. I want to get in there. Sort of I dream as a young art student, I want to become a great artist. So how do you get into a museum in a way? And then I have one of the centerpieces is what I call the portfolio review. I made hundreds of tiny little portfolios. So I have a laser cutter to help to do the ones with a handle. And then I just use some manila folders to fold up and punch some holes in it and tie with little ribbons, fill them with some styrofoam to make them look bulky. So it's all kind of make-believe, but I have these shelves filled with portfolios and then some very tiny little drawings scattered on the floor for the review part. So as the idea of my acceptance portfolio to art school. And I have names of some of my cohorts on some of the portfolios as a little nod to that history. And that actually, it's a bigger piece, so I have that with a bigger viewing, kind of a rounded crescent, or concave, convex coming out glass inserted in a wall, so about 12-inch lens, where I actually closed off two small side rooms with drywall, so they're kind of part of the structure. You kind of look into another world, and the open call is just stereotypic. But I try to recreate one of the big gallery spaces in the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum in Braunschweig as a holding space for an open call jury of thousands of gold leaf frames stacked up against all the walls from all sides, so you can barely walk through there with obviously not enough room on the wall for all of them. So you can sort of just imagine how many will have to be rejected, and sort of the odds against you as an artist to make it. When I applied to art school, the first thing they told us, like, yeah, about 2% of you will make it. Which actually lit up some fire under me and said, like, okay, I'm going to be one of them. I have to make this. But that was kind of both discouraging but also kind of realistic, I would say. A lot of my, or let's say relatively few of my cohorts from back then are still like really active as artists. There are some, but a lot of them have also shifted careers into some neighboring things. And well, as you know, a lot of printmakers, I could have easily just become a printmaker and just done my print shop, done collaborative work. It's very fulfilling for me. I love problem solving. I love working. But maintaining to be an artist throughout all that time has been really challenging. It kind of one of the reasons why I never could have kids, because I couldn't have done all of that at the same time, so I had to sacrifice something. But I'm happy I kind of tried to pursue that, and I think that fire is still in me from way back then when they told us only 2%.
Right. I have two thoughts for you. Yes. Can I interject? Yeah. One had to do with the Cabinet of Wonders, the buttons. Mm-hmm. The Cabinet of Wonders is fraught in the museum world, as you know, because it identifies the other cultures as, right? So to my mind, using the functional buttons that can come from all over the world puts that part aside mostly, and it becomes kind of this twist on it that I like. And then also the jury room and the portfolios, it's mm-hmm. a little bit of an institutional critique, which I always appreciate.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, even though I'm German, and maybe that's why I had to leave, I do have a sense of humor.
Germans are without humor, is what you're saying?
Well, they have the reputation, and they definitely have a bit, especially in the arts. They have, it's very. My wife has a word for my serious look. Don't make German face.
That's funny.
That's also sort of certain self-reflection or sort of self-humor built in there with it, like the hopes and desperation, but also, Yeah, and I mean, it's really ubiquitous and still there. I mean, with all the number of art schools there are, with all the super nice critiques we give our students, being afraid to tell them the full truth because we may not want to hurt them enough, and building up hopes that could never be realized in the real world. I mean, it's problematic, and that's kind of part of what goes into these pieces. That is like, okay, but your odds, you're maybe good in this very small group of cohorts, but then when you get out to the world, you are really like down here.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never make it up to the top, or you would have to really rethink your approach. And to light that fire early on, that my double bass teacher told me, yes, you're going to be, scraping in. Yeah, you get a lot of praise from other people. You're playing well in the orchestra. Yeah, but you'll never make it to the top. You're never going to be the section leader in a larger orchestra. You're going to be somewhere in a small town. Or the idea of them telling us only 2% of you will make it actually really helped me much more than discouraged me in the long time. It discouraged some of my cohorts. They kind of said, maybe I should do something else, which may have then also helped them in the long run to do something more satisfying for them in their lives, to kind of have their priorities, find their priorities.
Right.
So I find now I'm extending the institutional critique into our niceness in critiques in art schools, and educating so many young aspiring artists in a world that can we sustain this many? Definitely not. Do they know the odds against them? I doubt it. There's so much hope, and we're just deferring the disappointment.
I had I was down at the art school in Baltimore, the Maryland Institute College of Art, where one of your proteges is a senior, Leo.
Oh, Leo.
Yes. And he pulled me aside to show me what he's working on for his thesis show, which is next week, I think. He's still printing things. I'm like, oh, God.
Right.
But he, last fall, I had been a visiting critiquer there, and I had said something to him, which I didn't realize I said, but which he now credits me for changing how he approached his work and supposedly making it much better, which I was very gratified to hear. Although when he said, you said something to me, I was like, oh God, what did I say? But it was really that I wanted to see the personal in his work.
Right.
Right. And it was just that one thing. And it shifted how he was thinking about it. I mean, it took him a while. First, he was mad at me. And then, and then he.
But I remember so many critiques from art school where I was like so mad at my teachers because they really said something I either didn't want to hear, or where it was like I felt offensive. And, and this is, of course, we're getting into territory we shouldn't talk about now. But in the long run, I felt like, okay, now how can I counter that? How can I deflate that critique on that person? How can I show them that what I want is actually the right way and not what they want me to do? And so I'm going to double up or but it sort of, again, gave me that energy. But I think I see that in Leo. He has that, he listens and then reacts, and rather than feels like he is always in the right or something. So, but he has an amazing energy. He took one workshop in Truro at the Castle Hill. Their facilities were kind of like doable for photogravure, but like we had to improvise a lot. But from that, he went back to Mica and set it up and really making some photogravures. And I'm really amazed by his perseverance there and his energy. And and he extends that to pretty much everything he approaches, it seems like it. So
yeah, no, I think so.
Yeah, I really appreciate students with that kind of an energy.
Yeah. The other thing that occurred to me, I'm back in Hudson now, that there's an affinity with, this is going to sound weird, but the peep show. This idea of, well, not in a bad way though, like those sort of 19th century, the camera obscura and the cyclo, whatever that thing was.
Right.
Like there's this sort of link there back in time, which I like because your idea about memory, like it's all, the circle is very complete. Well done.
Oh, so photogravure also is a very nostalgic process by itself because it is, this 19th century look. It's like this pictorialist ideal. So
yeah,
a lot of photogravures I see throughout even if it was done just last year, it still has a lot of that look of the 19th century. So I always question, why would we need to do that now in the 21st century? So that's been always my thinking of what can I do? How can I bring this into meaningful, using this imminently nostalgic process with its imminently nostalgic look in this way in the 21st century. And yeah, and it's sort of, it's not that I came up with the solution because of that, but it sort of all became one symbiosis. Like the solution came naturally as a symbiosis to come where I'm now. But yeah, I'm happy that it worked for me. But yeah, I encourage other artists to kind of think of it the same way, to think like, okay, what can I do with it in the 21st century?
Right.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking that it's an amazing process. It's been chipped away on the edges because digital printing has become so good. Photopolymer plates, photogravure, which uses a plastic plate, has gotten so much better than it was just even 10 years ago, that huge chunks of the very narrow market of photogravure is disappearing. So photogravure is really kind of a very endangered species. There's only really a few dozen practitioners in the world who are good. There are even fewer that are excellent. And there are more who are okay. But it's really questioning the possibility of this process to stay alive for longer. And I feel, I've taught this process a lot. I have taught at least 150 workshops over the last 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, oh my God, that's a lot. Actually, I'm going to teach one tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
I have 12 students in my studio here who are coming in. I'm looking forward. I'm not looking forward. I'm not sure.
Can you get it done in one day? Does it take more than a day?
They came last Saturday and they're coming back this Saturday.
Okay.
So, and I prepared things for them to actually make it doable in 2 days. But yeah, I feel like I want to be an advocate for actually the process to survive, because I also see it in art schools more and more. It's like, oh, it's easier done on computer, but students become more and more reliant on the proprietary programs of Adobe and Epson, and have no more connection to the root of how to do something really simple. I have some colleagues who just recently created their own vine charcoal with grapevines from campus. We have so much like wild, they just growing up into the trees and are invasive almost. But so they are going back in their roots. It's like, oh, you know what? It's actually relatively simple. But the disconnect of, okay, I'm going to go to the store and buy this. I can just press a button and it prints. So, it did not print. It's like, okay. In photogravure, you really can go back to, it's like, okay, we can make this in our kitchen. Let's start with some paper, gelatin, pigment, make our own gelatin. And I've actually worked in some classes carbon printing into the process. Carbon printing is a related process in alternative photography, where the gelatin is pigmented with black.
Oh.
And then adhere to a gelatinized paper instead of a metal plate, and that is then the final image. You expose a negative instead of a positive. And it has raised gelatin, gelatin relief on that paper to make it look lighter and darker, and therefore looks even better than a photogravure, but it's a one-off, and you can't manipulate it afterwards, really. But it's still a beautiful process. And I learned that process about 10 years ago from this guy, Sandy King, in North Carolina. I think it was North Carolina, one of the Carolinas. When after Autotype, the last commercial manufacturer of this gelatin pigment paper didn't go out of business, but they discontinued that gelatin pigment paper because there was very little use or commercial use anymore, and the maker of the backing paper, Schoeller in Germany, discontinued that line of paper, and they didn't want to research another piece of paper for a relatively narrow dying market. But then what happened I always talk about his history, even if in art history, more like anecdotally. Like if I had been Piranesi, I would have done that kind of way of thinking. That's how I approach my art and my work. But there were still a lot of printing plants in India and Brazil, especially where labor is still pretty cheap. And the cost of building a new modern printing plant so high that they said, why change? And they still needed the gelatin pigment paper. So I don't know who, but some company came up with making their own new version of this gelatin pigment paper. And Cape Fear Press in Cape Fear, is that North Carolina? Or one of the Carolinas. Yeah. I used to be good in geography, but the Carolinas become one. She really started making sure those materials are all still available. So she sells that, she makes plates, she makes her own work, she collaborates and so on. But the main thing for me is that she continues to supply fine sources and supply material for photogravure. So she's doing an amazing job keeping this alive. Yeah, so it's still possible to do. But I learned that process when Autotype discontinued it before this gelatin pigment paper came on the market. But that is really photography in your kitchen, basically.
Can you quickly say that again that heliogravure is the same thing as photogravure?
Yes. Yeah, so heliogravure is the German name for photogravure, and it's the same process.
Thank you, because I have always wondered what it was. It was so unclear to me.
Even in French, like if you want to use the English, what we understand as photogravure in English is heliogravure in French or heliogravure in German.
Okay, great. That's helpful for all those catalogers out there. Hear ye, hear ye. Lothar, it's been wonderful talking to you. I so appreciate you coming on Platemark. It's really been fun.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Platemark with Lothar Osterburg. He's an amazing artist and equally fine professor of said technique, photogravure. So if you're curious, reach out to him and see if you can get into one of his workshops. Any images that we talk about, as I said at the top, are over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. And also over there is where you can hit the support and donate button and help me keep the lights on. A special thank you to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music, and one to Dan Fury of Extension Audio for being my fantastic sound mixer. I so appreciate the help. Okay, I think that's it. We'll see you next time.